Willow Creek Springs presents Healthy Living with your host, Joe Grumbine.
All right, hello and welcome back to the Healthy Living Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Grumbine, and today we have a very special guest with us. I have Keith Ellis, and Keith is the associate professor of medicinal chemistry in Virginia. And he's also the creator, the founder of a company called Science Driven Supplements. And he's been doing some work on long COVID and some solutions to help people that have suffered some of the effects of long COVID. And I know plenty of people that are going through this. So without any further ado, Keith, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Great, I'm doing good, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. And it's interesting as this show's been around now for a couple of years. I get people that reach out, a lot of times authors of recent books and things like that, trying to get their name out there. And you popped into our sites a few months ago, and I thought it was a good match. COVID has affected so many people. And the listeners of this show have a lot of varied opinions about that. And we have a lot of people that, are, they follow what the boss tells you and, do what your doctor says and go get 100 vaccines and maybe that'll solve your problems. And some of those people did that and found that they got different problems or more problems, or it didn't solve their problems at all. And as is mostly the case with any topic on this show, everything that we talk about is our experiences. And there are so many ways for everything to happen. In no way am I saying you have to do this or that will happen. Everybody's health is a very customized experience, just like your thumbprint and everybody else's. So take every bit of information, do your own research, compare what you're hearing to what you've experienced, and let's raise up each other's knowledge on some of these really important topics. So just tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you come to be here?
Sure. So, well, I kind of want to comment on something you just said, kind of
Yeah,
my perspective on, COVID really shook the world up, in a way that we are still kind of figuring out. And it caused all these realignments. It's caused all these questioning, right? And all of a sudden, things 5 years ago that people would have never questioned or never thought are that seemed crazy, right?
right,
Are now it's like, well, this is actually kind of obvious and common sense. And vice versa. Things that were common sense, it's like, why, how could we be crazy and have done that
right.
way?
Absolutely.
Um, so I'm really excited to talk to you because you're a natural products guy.
Right.
And by training, by education, early in my career, I was a natural products guy, natural products chemist, a
Nice.
medicinal chemist. And I'll tell you a little bit about my background. And when long COVID started for me as not a natural products project, and then it's actually returned me to my roots of really thinking about natural products in a very different way, in a way that aligns a lot with what you do. So I'm really excited to be here and to talk about that.
Cool.
So I'm an associate professor of medicinal chemistry. Medicinal chemistry is kind of that subtopic of chemistry that really deals with drug discovery, right?
Mhm.
So kind of as a medicinal chemist, I do chemistry, and I look a lot at pharmacology and biochemistry and what we call physiology, right? The mechanisms in the body of how the body's supposed to work. And then what happens mechanistically in the body when people get sick, right? And that's what we call pathophysiology. I'm going to try and not use too many big words, but some of these things
Oh,
just
it's
to
good.
give
Explain what the
people a
big word
sense,
means and everybody's
right?
cool.
So my kind of training, my upbringing, if you will, scientifically, I was a chemistry major in college, and then I did my PhD in natural product total synthesis. So I'm really an organic chemist by education. And then I took that interest in natural products and mechanisms more from a chemical point of view, and went and did postdoctoral training in medicinal chemistry. And the mentor I worked for really specialized in taking natural products and using them as the initial starting point to develop pharmaceutical drugs. And I did that training kind of late 2000s, right? 2006, 7, 8 is when I was doing that training. And up until that point in time, up until around the year 2000, the early 2000s, using natural products as a starting point to start discovering pharmaceutical drugs was kind of standard practice. It's what we did all the time. It's where a lot of the drugs that people learned about and were developed and went to market and people took for diseases in the 20th century, for the most part, came from, at least in some way, from natural products. Maybe they were a natural product themselves. Maybe the mechanism or the biological target, the protein in the body that we're trying to target, maybe that was discovered by a natural product. But natural remedies have been our inspiration in science for a long time, up until the early 2000s. So
we had
as
really
I
big, strong pharmaceutical companies.
That's right. Well, and that was the interesting thing. So I started my career kind of with that same approach. I started with natural products, use those as kind of the inspiration to start trying to develop new molecules to develop into drugs. Kind of the area that I've spent my career, my independent career in as a faculty member, what I like to do is what I think of as early lead discovery. So I like going into the scientific literature, looking at a disease state, saying, okay, this is a new protein, this is a new mechanism in the body, this is a new mechanism in a disease state that now we can use to address and hopefully make people better by developing a drug, and then doing that real early work to discover the initial molecules that we start with, called hits, and then developing those into leads and eventually into drug candidates. So I like that early stage section. It's new and interesting and changes all the time. And that's kind of what has always drawn my interest. So, okay, so I start my career, and as I'm probably in the first decade, by 2015, by 2020, industry really moved away, and academia moved with it, away from using natural products as the inspiration, as the starting point for new drugs. Um, Probably by 2010, 2012, most of the big pharma companies had closed their natural product divisions for use for drug discovery, right? They
Wow.
just moved out of the area. And we moved to more sophisticated methods, like what we call high throughput screening, where you have a big library of compounds and you just start testing them to try and find new compounds. We started using automation. We started using stuff that was what we call higher throughput, where you could just do things faster. And industry moved away from that, and like I said, academia kind of moved with it. So, and I say all that and I mention all that because that's kind of the background story of what happened when COVID hit. Right. So obviously, COVID hitting really changed the world. There were huge shakeups and a lot of issues that people can talk about. A lot of polarization. Right. A lot
Huge.
of people taking stands not necessarily based on data, but because of external factors to science, which is never a way you want to do things. And the common sense middle got lost as we went through the pandemic in a lot of ways.
Well,
And
I
I
think a lot of that has to do with just the information and how it was being sent and who it was coming from and what it was saying. And, I don't know that even, I think that people's opinions are swayed by feelings more than facts. And so, when you combine people's personal experiences with these things people are telling you, no way to know what's true or not. And people just started reacting, to their feelings and things. And I think that's where a lot of this polarization comes from. But I think another piece of this puzzle is um, I think people were becoming aware. And again, I don't mean to derail you, but I think it's an
no.
important conversation, because I think people became aware of where this information was coming from. And I think people started to think for themselves through this. And I think it
Mhm.
came from drinking a lot of Kool-Aid and then testing, the purple tongue with what you were being told. And you're going, but wait a minute, my tongue's purple and they're telling me
Yeah.
something else. I got to start challenging something. I think that's where some of that came
Yeah.
from.
No, and absolutely. And that's why, the world is very different now and it's topsy-turvy compared to the way it used to be. And, when you start arguing about science with feelings and emotions and not data, everyone loses,
Yep.
right? And people do have those emotional reactions when things get censored. And when you're told that you're not allowed to see information, when you're told you're not allowed to have or to try things for yourself because somebody else knows better, it does evoke feelings from people. And say what you want about which side you think is right or wrong.
Right.
But all of that process is where we've landed now, where there's huge amounts of distrust in all of the systems kind of
Exactly.
universally, right?
Right.
And it's created a distrust in pharmaceuticals. It's created a lot of these trends of people wanting to go back to more natural remedies. And a lot of what has happened since COVID and now, going on almost 5 years later is really what happened is what created that distrust and what it has encouraged people to think for themselves and look for alternative solutions. And I guess you could kind of throw me in there where I'm actually doing something very different than I ever anticipated doing from what I planned to do. So my kind of experience with working on COVID and long COVID as a researcher, as a scientist, was in early 2023. I kind of started looking around, and COVID had been with us for a while, and we seemed to have a handle on acute COVID infections, right? The hospitalization rate was down. People were not dying as much as they were right at the beginning of the pandemic. The acute COVID infection kind of situation, we seemed to be managing it better. We had some drugs to manage it. That seemed to have been dealt with. The problem that I was kind of interested in, because I could see it coming. It's like that slow motion train wreck you can see coming. And
Right.
there was not a lot of options available for people, was long COVID, right?
Mhm.
Long COVID, by early 2023, it was fairly clear long COVID was kind of a separate condition. It
Mhm.
was a secondary condition after an acute COVID infection, but it was definitely its own distinct thing. And there wasn't a whole lot of things being done for people or a lot of options for people that were suffering from long COVID. So I decided, okay, I want to start working on this. And I figured I would be doing like a normal academic project for myself. So I used the kind of the process I normally use. I went to the scientific literature and I started looking at mechanisms, physiological mechanisms, like what I mentioned, pathophysiology, right? The mechanisms of how the disease works and interacts with the body and causes the ill health effects and the symptoms and everything else. And I spent some time in the literature and I looked around and I had one of those experiences where like you've got your head down in something, you're working on it for a while, and you're putting a lot of time and energy into it, and then you reach a point and you kind of lift your head up and you say, that's it. And you're kind of shocked and angry at like the same time. I
Right.
had kind of that experience with the long COVID literature because my expectation when I went to go look at the scientific literature, I knew, because a lot of my colleagues have some of these things. There's a lot of money going into COVID and long COVID research, right? There's a ton of grant money going into the area, and there was a ton of papers being published. So when I went into the scientific literature, I was like, well, of course we know something about long COVID. We have to know something about the mechanism. We've had enough time. There's enough resources going in. We should know some of these things.
Right.
And when I went into the literature, and what I came away with was that we were doing science the same old way we always do science, which means we're taking our time and not doing anything in a hurry. And there was a kind of a lack of focus in the scientific literature, which is kind of what made me mad. You know, COVID kind of changed the whole world, right? And all of a sudden we realized, hey, if we have to deal with these bigger problems, we have to have some focus. We have to prioritize things. We have to actually do something. And what I saw in the scientific literature was there was a lot of people doing a lot of work, a lot of very good work. And I don't mean to disparage anybody that was working in the area or publishing. It's all outstanding work. What really kind of made me mad was the lack of focus, because at the end of the day, when I went into the literature, there were no validated molecular targets for me to start drug discovery on. There was not very much information on mechanisms for what was causing long COVID. There was a lot of work being done on kind of, okay, here's a symptom. We're going to explore what the immediate underlying mechanism is that's causing the symptom, but kind of thinking more strategically of, well, what's causing that mechanism to happen that's causing the symptom, getting back to really causative mechanisms. People just weren't there yet. And part of me understood that, because science is a process, right? Good science does take time. In science, we all stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us, and we need all of their data. But again, I think what really kind of gave me my reaction was the fact that I knew so much time and money was going into the space, and that there wasn't more of a plan and more of a focus. So understanding then that, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to start drug discovery, which is really bad. Like, I just want to, because if I can't, then big pharma certainly can't.
Right. Who's
And
to do this?
right, and we all know that to develop new drugs for a new condition takes anywhere from 10 to 15 years or more, from the time you start drug discovery to the time a drug really hits the market and is available for a physician to prescribe to a patient. There's this long lead time of 10 to 15 years of going through just the discovery process, and then development, and going through preclinical development, clinical development. Like, it's a long process for a reason, right? It all has to be done to make sure that the drugs are potent, effective, safe, right? That they actually do work. Like, it's not that anything's being overdone. You have to do all those things, but it takes time. So the thought that I had was basically, these people with long COVID, no one's coming to help them anytime soon. From a pharmaceutical point of view. Right. And that, to me, that was kind of a problem, right? Because there's people suffering today. There's actually a lot of people suffering from long COVID. And at that point, I had gotten to know some people with long COVID, really started talking to some people, and they had just crazy stories of going to the doctor and being told it was all in their head. Going to the doctor and getting sent to specialist, and passed from specialist to specialist to specialist. Because that's something else we can talk about. Long COVID tends to hit multiple physiological symptoms. So it's somewhat difficult to deal with clinically. So all of these things, are the systems we have that have worked well for a long, long time, just did not seem to be helping the long COVID patients the way they should. And to me, that meant, well, okay, maybe we need to take a look at this and do something a little bit different.
Well, it would stand to reason, that there's all these different problems in many of the statements that you said, and they're not necessarily solvable problems. So, for example, with COVID, we had this quote new disease that came out, and all of a sudden all these people are getting sick and dying, and then magically within less than a year we have not only a new vaccine, but a new type of vaccine. And we didn't need 15 years. We didn't need all this other stuff. We just somehow made a way for that to happen. And then not only that, but then they turned around and said, okay, well, not only is this okay, but it works good enough that we're going to start enforcing it, making it happen. And people were not only encouraged, but coerced and even worse. And for a drug that in some cases, some of these vaccines were actually recalled and taken off the market
Yeah.
for various reasons. And you think to yourself, wow, like it makes no sense that we can't have some, like you said, some kind of common sense middle ground that says, well, when things are not working the way they need to solve a problem that needs to be solved, maybe we open up the doors a little more and make it,
Yeah.
a more fertile ground for people to get in there and try. And I doubt seriously, I don't know the answer to this, but I doubt
Mhm.
seriously if you're ever going to have a difficulty in finding people willing to do experimental procedures and drugs. Because when people are faced with a condition that they don't have an answer for, the answer is in these experimental procedures and drugs, and people are willing to try regardless of the risk. And so I
Mhm.
don't know, it seems to me like there should be this playing field that allows for a different set of rules if people
Yeah.
are willing to go into it.
Well, and typically we have always had that. So I've spent a lot of my career working in the oncology area, right?
Mhm.
And historically in oncology drug development, there have been kind of looser boundaries,
Sure.
restrictions on getting people started on experimental therapeutics. And typically the trade-off was like they would take patients into those trials that were really sick and had no other option, right? And then they
Exactly.
would go into the trial and see if it would work and help. And
It
then
was a miracle cure that would overcome all the other stuff that they had already done and solve this problem,
yeah,
which
uh
has its own set of problems.
right. So, but typically the philosophy, at least the way I always understood it, was you gave people the choice.
Right.
And there were always some safeguards for, well, they wouldn't want to take somebody that was like too sick or had something too different going on because it would skew study results. And I get some of those criteria, but in general, prior to COVID, the the impetus in the medical system was always more towards letting people try things to see if they would help, as long as they weren't dangerous or have super deleterious effects, right?
Right.
And that's one of those things that shifted during COVID. And that's kind of actually one of the things that trying to get back to that attitude of being able to give people a choice and giving them an option to let them decide, right? Was kind of the attitude I had in doing what I did next with long COVID. So when I looked at the scientific literature and I saw, okay, there's not really good options here for pharmaceutical drug discovery. What I would normally do it. I had gotten to know enough people with long COVID. I was like, well, somebody's got to help these people, right?
Right.
Like, we can't just do nothing, which was kind of what what's being done with long COVID to a certain extent. Nobody, especially in terms of trying to formulate things that people can take to help them recover or to support them or make their symptoms better. There was not a lot of work going on for customized solutions for long COVID. There's a lot of repurposing going on, some of it well reasoned with mechanistic rationale, some of it not. But there was just not a lot of help for people with long COVID.
So
So
let me jump into that for a second, and just simply because I don't know the answer to it,
yeah.
is when we're talking about long COVID and its symptoms, and then
Mhm.
the treatments that they're doing. I mean, obviously, it would make sense that they're whatever treatments and solutions they have for COVID, they would be using. So we're looking at this long COVID as a completely different um,
Yes.
scenario rather than this is COVID with some kind of a variable that we don't
Yeah.
necessarily understand or that we don't know. Hang on
Yeah.
one. Honey, please come here. So, anyways, um, that is it's something that to me, I think our own I don't know, common sense procedures or practices sometimes get in our own way. Like
Yeah.
there's a percentage of people that got affected very dramatically and very different from all the other people that got the same virus and that
Yep.
went through the same set of whatever their symptoms were. And then they got this extra hitchhiker, if you will, that
Yeah.
just stayed on. And so now, the doctors that are treating these people, they are given whatever the protocols or their drugs or the
Mhm.
treatments to use, and they don't see a difference. This is the
Yeah.
same person that came in with this same virus. He was tested. He went through whatever his protocols were, and now he's over here and he's still complaining of these problems or maybe even new problems. And this doctor's like, "Well, I don't know. We've already done."
Well, and this is what it is. It's new problems. So
Right.
the way it typically works with long COVID is, a person will get an acute COVID infection, right? And most of us know what that looks like. Most of us had COVID, right? It's that high fever, it's the respiratory symptoms, it's like a super bad cold or flu,
Right.
just puts you in bed for a couple of days.
Mhm.
Illness that we're used to dealing with. It's just COVID-19 and acute infections, particularly bad, especially it tends to have a higher fever, right?
Right.
And it tends to really debilitate your energy to the point where it is hard to even get out of bed, right? But then most people will recover from that, and the majority of the population does, and they recover and they get back to being healthy and they can go about their life.
Exactly fine. Yeah.
Now, with the long COVID people, that doesn't happen. So with
Right.
people with long COVID, they get the acute COVID infection. And as they start to recover, they recover some, but usually not completely. Maybe
Mhm.
they'll get 60, 80, even 90% better, but some of the effects still linger. They still have a lingering cough or some congestion. They still have lingering fatigue. The fever doesn't tend to linger. So they don't look like they're sick in an acute way, but
Right.
there's these persistent symptoms that stick with them. And then typically somewhere in the window of 3 to 6 months after their acute COVID infection, they start collecting new symptoms and they get worse, but they get worse in a different way. And
Okay.
this is what medicine and science have not figured out kind of how to deal with yet. So the symptoms for long COVID are what I think of as kind of heterogeneous. Different people with long COVID will actually have different symptoms. And
Mhm.
I've come to really group the symptoms in there's like core symptoms, and then there's this broader constellation of symptoms that some people get them and some people don't. And it's like a buffet. Some people get A and B and some people get C and D. And that's
Got it.
why long COVID patients don't all look exactly the same. So the
Yeah.
core symptoms tend to be fatigue, brain fog, a lack of mental clarity. Um,
Mhm.
there's usually some kind of respiratory and cardiac effect, like a shortness of breath, maybe even with mild activity, some issues with controlling heart rate. So
Mhm.
those are kind of the core symptoms. And then beyond that, as people get worse with their long COVID, it can escalate into getting worse, but it gets worse across multiple systems physiologically. So there's circulatory symptoms. Typically, one of the hallmarks of long COVID is inflammation in the lining of the blood vessels in the whole body, right? So you've got that inflammation to deal with. There are cardiac effects. So a lot of times they'll develop more severe heart rate issues. They'll have tachycardia. Sometimes it even progresses to what's called POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where basically when they stand up, they can't control their heart rate. And it's
Mhm.
not because of low blood pressure, it's because of more autonomic nervous system type dysfunction. So they can end up with POTS. They'll end up with more severe shortness of breath and other cardiac symptoms. They'll end up with additional kind of CNS symptoms. On top of the brain fog, there can be really bad headaches. There can be anxiety. There can be depression because there's thought to be issues with neuroinflammation in long COVID. There's
Well, let me
immune
stop you
system.
for a second. It seems
Yeah.
like a lot of these symptoms that you're describing are symptoms that in the last 20 years have become ubiquitous in humanity's experience, and they're coming from multiple reasons, from our diet to compounds we're exposed to electronic interference to sleep patterns, stress, all of these reasons, things like the very
Yep.
the very symptoms you're describing, with heart issues, with inflammation is rampant in humanity today. And all of these respiratory issues with, microplastics and all of these things. I can't help but wonder, just like, with the rise of cancers and especially in younger people, and all of these, ailments that seem to be around today that didn't seem to be around when we were youngsters, when I was a youngster anyways, at least not in the numbers that they are today. I can't
Yeah.
help but think that somehow it's more complicated than just this one thing.
So it is an interesting observation, and so there's also a lot of those lifestyle things that you mentioned do tend to cause some of the symptoms. They tend not to cause maybe all of them,
Right.
but what in another kind of in line with the observation you made is it's being increasingly recognized that there are other illnesses that have a similar constellation of symptoms. Things
Mhm.
like chronic fatigue syndrome, things like West Nile and Lyme, and to a
Right.
certain extent fibromyalgia,
Mhm.
right? And what I tend to be seeing in my reading of the literature, which isn't complete, so it's part like analysis of literature and part instinct of here's what we're going to see next,
Mhm.
is in all of these disease states, it's like the top line symptoms are all very similar, right? There's a
Right.
lot in common. There's overlapping, but not identical.
Right.
Okay. But then I think as you drill down into the mechanism level, physiologically, we're going to see one of two things. I think all of these these other diseases, long COVID, along with things like chronic fatigue syndrome, Lyme disease, West Nile, I think what we're going to end up seeing is they all have a unique molecular level mechanism.
Okay.
But then as that mechanism manifests.
This has been another episode of the Healthy Living Podcast. We produce this show so that people can share their stories, people that have overcome obstacles, people that are undergoing obstacles. We're building a community of health-minded individuals. If you're interested in supporting the show, please leave a review on the platform you're listening to it on. If you're interested in becoming a guest, please send an email to itsjoegrumbine@gmail.com, or you can send a note into the notes section of the podcast. All right. Well, thank you for supporting this show, and we hope you've enjoyed it.